Hello again, everybody. I hope you've had a productive and enjoyable first day of your discussions. I'd now like to welcome Arvind Krishna, Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of IBM, a man who has spent his career not just as a business leader, but as a technologist. And so I think the perfect person for a very practical conversation on how digital transformation can be harnessed to make progress on sustainability, on the journey that you are on, that we are all on, and how it can be harnessed to be a social and environmental good. And Arvind, thank you for joining us. I wanted to start actually with your message to investors. I think it was this month, March 2021, where you said, what we have witnessed over the past year is an acceleration of digital transformation. There is no going back. In the next 2 to 3 years, we expect to see digital transformation at a rate that before 2020 we thought would take 5 to 10 years. So it's happening very fast thanks to COVID. How much of an opportunity is this to make the journey towards sustainability a faster and more effective one?
Zanny, thanks for the question, and it's great to be able to share some thoughts with the Economist. Look, I think our current estimates are $7.4 trillion is going to be spent on digital transformation in the next 3 years. To the point you made, that's a dramatic acceleration from just a year and a half ago. Of course, the crises we're in, health, economic, social justice, all of it contribute to that speed. And we can see that in different industries. Telemedicine, we have probably all talked about it for 20 years, is now happening. Automation in factories in order to take advantage of technologies like artificial intelligence is happening. And every industry, every retailer, even every Main Street store is turning into an omni-channel enterprise because that's how you can deal with your clients. You look underneath that, there's two fundamental technologies. One is artificial intelligence and the other is cloud. And the fact that we're only 20% of the journey into cloud is a big reason why this acceleration is going to happen. And artificial intelligence, the other technology, offers an opportunity to harness all the value from the 175 zettabytes of data we're all likely to generate. So two fundamental technologies, always driven by crisis. I think there's a famous phrase that one of your compatriots probably did a century ago. Necessity is the mother of invention, so we have a need. And so we're out inventing and innovating against those needs. And by the way, these technologies offer us a way to then rethink climate change and the whole carbon footprint that we are all creating as humans. And it's time to go attack that, I think, with all the technology and all the tools.
Well, we'll get to climate change specifically in a minute, but let's just stick with what you're hearing from your clients as they are, accelerating this transformation. Is how front and center in their thinking is sustainability as they do this?
It's becoming more and more a big piece of the conversation. Look, I think as the first piece is always about how do I survive this crisis and how do I come out stronger? Unlike other crises, this has not been only about cost control. The conversation invariably is how do I emerge stronger? Now, as part of emerging stronger, they're all worried about talent. They're all worried about being good citizens in their environments. And so sustainability then comes up, but it's no longer lip service. I would tell you 10 years ago, people bought some offsets, maybe did a few other things. Some people claim to be green, I'll say in quotes, but then they didn't look at their supply chain. They didn't look at how they behave themselves. That is fundamentally changing now, where people believe this is real. Now, always, I think that policy legislation play a role. So people are afraid that the heavy hand of regulation may come down, and that's worse than if they begin to take action. And that's why I think that this time it's quite real, where people are worried about sustainability.
And where are you seeing, which technologies, which areas are you seeing that kind of linking of their digital transformation with their sustainability goals the most? I mean, are there specific areas, specific focuses that you see coming through?
I don't think that it's by industry as much as by domain. So electricity, which contributes maybe a fourth in the worst case to global greenhouses, is one area where there is a lot of focus on renewable and clean energy. The second area there's a lot of talk about is transportation, but Look, I mean, EV cars only touch a tiny amount that's over there. You still have ships and airlines and trucking and railways and so many other things where there is a massive amount to go. And that's where you see people beginning to talk about things like hydrogen. So you see real investments now in hydrogen from a bunch of energy companies. You're seeing real investment in clean energy from a number of companies. People talk about carbon sequestration, but my view, it's still a toy technology. Carbon sequestration is not anywhere near mature enough or cheap enough to attack what is the number 50 billion tons of carbon dioxide alone that is produced globally each year. So a ways to go in terms of some of those technologies, but the effort is real. It's moving, but we need to up the rate, pace, acceleration, and adoption.
What about the other side of the ledger? Is there anything about, the energy costs of computing that worries you right now? I mean, some of the current generation blockchains, for example, are they sensible from an environmental perspective? Do we have to worry about, the acceleration of computational power itself being problematic from a sustainability perspective?
So, two questions in there, Zanny. I'm not worried about the total cost of energy for computation. If we turn around and say, look, information technology and technology in general is powering half the world's economy, then to consume 10% of the energy, which is kind of the upper bound on what you'll do to power half the economy, seems not unreasonable, given that energy and GDP are often tied together and computing is responsible for such a large part of GDP growth. Now, your other question in there, some of the mining technologies around cryptocurrencies, I'm not going to name which ones. I look at those numbers and they're ludicrous. I mean, it makes no sense. But I guess as long as people are willing to try it and the ones who are paying for the currency don't seem to be the ones paying for the energy, you got a disconnect in there between the different incentives. So I do think that doesn't make any sense. It's somewhat mind-boggling.
It is mind-boggling, but is there an opportunity there to find ways that get that same effect that you need from the current blockchain technology, but without such extraordinary requirements of power?
I don't think we need to have that requirement of power. If you're going to use what is called mining-based technologies, where you set apart hundreds of thousands of computers out on a given task, and the first one to get there succeeds, then effectively you wasted 99,999 people's energy. If you go towards permission blockchains, which are much more common in supply chains, food safety, pharmaceuticals, vaccine management, maybe digital passports, those are incredibly efficient from an energy perspective. It is simply when you have anonymous currency that you get into those issues. So I think blockchain as a technology is a great technology. Anonymous cryptocurrency is sort of a different question, but far from it for my place to say, hey, should that or should that not exist? I think people there should turn around and say, how can you be more energy efficient? And I think the anonymous nature of those is also quite interesting to governments around the globe.
So yeah, absolutely. Let's turn then to technology itself in terms of the being part of the solution to climate change, which is something you raised at the beginning of our conversation. To what degree do you think that you are going to be part of the solution? I mean, if you listen to, I'm sure you've read Bill Gates's book. It's a huge part of the solution in his and many other people's views.
Look, I'm going to be a bit of a contrarian, probably agree with Bill Gates, but be a bit of a contrarian to say technology is going to be an essential part of the solution going forward. There are many who say, look, this is a question of political will or regulation or policy. I actually think those will be the secondary tools, not the primary. You're going to need technology first and foremost. Look, let's take simple examples. There's so much media attention, there is so much political attention on electric vehicles. Transportation is 15% of the total contribution to global greenhouses globally. There's another 16% equal to transportation that comes from cement and steel. There's going to be a few trillion square feet of buildings put over all over the globe. Are we really going to say we're not going to put up those buildings? So, what are the technologies being worked on to reduce the impact on cement and steel? So, that's a huge area that we need to go work on. And so you need to worry about how do you do carbon sequestration from those industries, or how do you do cheaper technologies? Because then there are some who will say, look, the technology is there. And my reaction is, no, it's not. It's not even remotely close to being cheap enough. If I look at the United States and the EU 28, just as an exemplar, between them, they consume maybe 25% or contribute 25% of total environmental issues in terms of global greenhouse gases. By the way, all of them together, not just carbon dioxide, but carbon, nitrogen, sulfur, the fluoride-based gases, etc. So you say if that's only 25%, you can do all you liked in the developed world, you still got 75% out there. And we know that we need reductions more like 50% in total. So you've got to have solutions that are effective in economies that are still advancing. Because if you tell them, hey, don't build this coal-fired power plant, they're going to look at you and say, so you're asking me to live without electricity at all? So you need to have cheaper answers. So second big area where you need to go. And so you asked, are you part of the solution or the problem? I mean, you didn't quite say that, but I'll paraphrase it that way. I think we're definitely part of the solution. I mean, one quick example. We used artificial intelligence techniques and presented a paper recently at the American Physical Society. So a place where chemists and physicists go out to hang out and talk about forward-looking research. That is possible to build much better membranes using AI techniques by ingesting and reading the literature, figuring out what to do, that are much more cost effective at capturing carbon dioxide from industrial effluents. Okay, if those become more cost effective, now we can talk about the next step. Now, how do you capture this carbon dioxide? Do you capture it in solids? Do you put it underground, etc.? I was talking to somebody in the oil services industry, and they said, look, there's very many old wells where you can actually put liquid carbon dioxide and keep it there for hundreds, if not thousands of years. That sounds promising. Would we actually do that more cost effectively? Or can we have less toxic materials? And there's again AI techniques to go do that. So I am excited by what we can do, by what our scientists can do if you turn their attention onto this problem. And I think that that's where governments can help by making it more effective to do those things. I'd also tell you that I and IBM are probably big fans of carbon tax because that gives a market-based incentive to go help solve these problems. Not a panacea. Nothing in here is a panacea. But I think we need to make all this progress in order to go help solve these issues.
Yeah, well, we would completely agree with you on that. One question that you put it interestingly, you said that technology can and should go first, with the policy changes second. But then at the end of your answer just then, you explained that you needed to have the environment created so that there are the incentives for the innovation to take place. So there is a kind of chicken and egg here, right? And how much do you think can happen organically in terms of innovation without the full environment of carbon taxes and so forth?
Whether it's carbon taxes or whether it's, I'll call it political will, or perhaps will by people, I think all of those come together. What I meant by, so you can have a carbon tax, but if the technology is really expensive, all people will do is trade out the carbon tax and simply say, okay, I got to deal with it. It's like a common tax. It's like a goods and services tax that goes across the board. It's an equal playing field. So you need to have the technology come down to where it becomes a competitive advantage. Yes, I'm going to have a carbon tax, but if I use these technologies and they're cheap enough, my tax is lower. So I now get a business advantage to doing those things. That's what I meant by saying the technology has to come first. Otherwise, regulation just puts on a sort of a base tax on everyone with no particular change in the behavior. So that helps make sense.
I see. And how much is government investment in R&D, basic kind of public-private working together, essential to get that pace of innovation up? I mean, that's a debate too, right? The Biden administration is proposing to put a huge amount into government R&D. Is that an essential part for scaling this up?
I think the history has shown that it's a wonderful accelerant to making these things happen. So just for me to take two very quick examples. In the 1960s, when we did the Apollo lunar landing program, you could turn around and say that a lot of techniques on semiconductors, GPS systems, materials, the early days of communication, even supply chains came about because of that program. So the program was aimed at putting man on the moon, but because there was private parties that did all the underlying work, they then took the outcome of that work and used it very, very effectively. Fast forward to the early 1990s, government investment in R&D for what eventually became called the internet. I would say we all see the benefits of that today, especially when work is remote and during COVID. So the benefit can be measured in the trillions, but expenses that are in the tens, maybe 100 billion. That's a great return for the global economy and for how a private public partnership works.
Absolutely. Let's, in our last few minutes, turn to the S and G parts of ESG. So and the degree to which you think technology can help tackle social issues and challenges. I mean, is that a priority for you? Is there a strong role for technology there? And is there anything specific you'd point to?
Absolutely. First, we are very, very strong believers. I'll use a catchphrase, tech for good, but that plays to the social and environmental part of what you're talking about. And I'm really pleased to tell this audience, I think this morning, we announced the latest round of the Call for Code. And the Call for Code is not just IBM. It's IBM, it's the David Clark cause, it's the United Nations, where you try to tap into the innovation of the 24 million developers and data scientists out there. And this year's Call for Code is focused on climate change. And just to give some couple of examples from last year, where we were focused on disasters and agriculture, where one of the solutions was called Agroli. And it really lets farmers, in that case, across whether it's Brazil or Mongolia, look at what should they plant best, given the impact of climate change in their environments. There was another one that was based on in a disaster scenario. Think Puerto Rico during Hurricane Maria. How do you create some connectivity amongst all the people, even though the infrastructure is totally out? And so our commitment in there is that this is not just writing a check. We're going to take the solutions that these developers come up with, we're going to incubate them, we're going to make the code available, we're going to sustain them, and we're going to deploy them. And so there's a few dozen of these that are already being selected. And my hope certainly is that as we turn on these 24 million developers onto the climate change problem, you'll get some interesting analytics, some interesting algorithms, some interesting code, and and the community of about 500,000 who are already active on the Call for Code platform should be able to do that. I really think that this is a different way to leverage the power of technology than only writing a check. Checks are important. I'm not going to dismiss writing checks, but I think actually doing the work is even more important.
So it's crowdsourcing ideas and doing the work. But how do you set the terms of that? Who decides what the focus should be and what the call is for?
Well, so each year there's a different call. The three sponsoring organizations, David Clark Cause, DCC, IBM, and the United Nations get together. But look, it's you use the word crowdsourced. I use the word ecosystem. You're tapping into what these developers would like to work on. So you've got to tap into what they want to do. We can all agree, hey, we want to work on something. And if those 24 million look at it and say, this is uninteresting, you'll get no input. So it's always this balance between what the ecosystem wants and you've got to tap into what their ambitions are. By the way, I'm not worried on climate change. I think it is such an important topic. We'll have no dearth of people who want to participate. By the way, the goal is not just giving them a platform. The goal is that they create technology in software which is sustainable. And that, by the way, is quite motivating to a number of developers. As they develop software which gets deployed at scale and has the name attached to it, that is what will motivate them to go get it solved.
Yeah, absolutely. One last question, though, which is the sort of flip side of that, in terms of mitigating the negative impacts, social impacts of technology. I mean, there are many and many perceived ones. How much do you think about that? How much do you feel that you have a sense of responsibility to minimize those negative effects? And how do you go about doing that?
Oh, massive. Look, there's a couple that I'll mention. The privacy of data and how data can be used and misused is one that we are deeply concerned about. That's why we created principles around data usage as you train and leverage artificial intelligence systems. As you go forward on AI, how fair and equitable are they? I'll use the word equitable. So How do you work on that? How do you modify the technologies? How do you hold yourself to a standard? How do you begin to publish what data you used? How did you use it? How do you make sure these systems don't drift from how we would like them to behave? The same way as we hold humans responsible to these standards. And so you can hear in those words that we are quite committed towards trying to use technology in a way that furthers our goals of social justice, doesn't drive an even bigger divide into society. Look, technology is going to be used. I think that is a given. Now we've got to make sure it's used well and in a way that furthers our social goals, not counters them.
And what's to conclude? What's your metrics for success on this? I mean, you've articulated very clearly your commitment, IBM's commitment. If we meet again in, let's say, at this event in 3 years' time, and I say, okay, you made a very strong case in 2021. Now, tell us what you've achieved. What would you like to be saying?
I would like to tell you a few things. One, we made a commitment that by 2030 we are going to be zero carbon footprint. We actually believe that we're not going to do that through offsets. We will do over 90% of that by actually using only clean energy and contributing no carbon back into the environment. We have to make progress on that. So we have set 65% as our goal by the midpoint, not 50. So we want to be at 65% by 2025. You can hold us to that and say, have you made progress on that? Secondly, on many of the science technologies, I would like to be able to point to areas where we have made inventions, we have made innovations, and in most cases, probably those are just given back to the community because we are not in the business of manufacturing these materials. Perhaps we'll have partners who will do that. And there are some early examples on that with some things we are doing that MIT and other universities are looking at to see how they can be scaled. You can hold us to both of those.
We will do. And I look forward to that conversation in a few years' time. Arvind Krishna, thank you so much for joining us.
Zanny, my pleasure.